Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore the extraordinary journeys of everyday people, uncovering tales of resilience, courage, and justice. Today's story dives into the heart of a confrontation that became more than a dispute. It became a fight for dignity and accountability. Join us as we reveal Marcus's inspiring battle for truth and self-respect. It was a sunny afternoon in East Atlanta, the kind of day that makes people think of barbecues, long walks, and errands they've been putting off. Marcus Williams had just finished his morning shift and decided to stop at the local grocery store. A tall, composed man in his early 30s. Marcus was known for his quiet demeanor and unyielding patience. Having grown up in a working-class neighborhood, he learned early on to pick his battles carefully. Little did he know, today would test that resolve. The parking lot was crowded, as it often was on weekends. Cars wove through the lanes in a slow, chaotic dance, each driver hoping to snag a spot close to the entrance. As Marcus rounded the corner, he saw it, a prime spot just a few steps from the doors. He signaled, eased into the space, and turned off his car. With a sigh of relief, he grabbed his shopping list and prepared to step out. Then he heard it, the screech of tires, sharp and angry, cutting through the chatter of the parking lot. Marcus turned to see a white SUV pulling up aggressively next to him. The driver's window rolled down, and there she was, a middle-aged white woman with meticulously styled blonde hair and a face flushed with anger. Her piercing glare seemed to radiate heat as she leaned out of the window. "That was my spot," she yelled, jabbing a manicured finger in Marcus's direction. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the lot. Marcus blinked, startled by the intensity of her tone. "Excuse me," he replied, his voice calm but firm. He glanced around, confused. He hadn't seen anyone signaling for the spot. She slammed her car door shut and stormed toward him, her heeled sandals clacking against the pavement. "I was waiting for that spot," she spat, her words dripping with disdain. "My blinker was on. You saw me." Marcus took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay composed. "I didn't see anyone," he said, trying to de-escalate. "The spot was open when I arrived." Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "Of course you didn't see me. You people never do. Do you?" The words hit Marcus like a slap, but he kept his composure. He had heard these kinds of comments before, the subtle, loaded phrases that implied so much more than they said. Her tone was confrontational, entitled, and now unmistakably racial. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "It's just a parking spot. I don't want any trouble." She stepped closer, invading his space, her voice rising. "Trouble? You think I'm causing trouble? You people are the trouble, coming into our neighborhoods, acting like you own the place. You don't even belong here." Marcus clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. He glanced around, noting the curious stares of a few bystanders who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. He wanted to walk away, to let her rage burn itself out. But something about her words rooted him to the spot. They weren't just insults. They were accusations. A declaration that he didn't belong. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice firm this time, "I'm just here to get groceries. Please, let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be." But Susan Thompson was beyond reason. She stepped forward again, raising her hand. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed. And before Marcus could react, the slap came, hard and fast, echoing through the parking lot. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the sting of Susan's slap radiating across his cheek. The sharpness of the act shocked him more than the pain itself. He'd faced confrontation before, endured the covert and overt racism that often tainted his daily life. But this was something different. This was bold, public, and unabashed, a slap meant to humiliate him, to remind him of where she thought he belonged. His thoughts raced, the words "you people" replaying in his mind like a bitter refrain. The air in the parking lot thickened with tension. A few onlookers stood rooted in place, their faces a mix of shock and anticipation. No one intervened. No one spoke up. It was as if they were waiting to see what Marcus would do, silently judging him, calculating how he would respond. Marcus unclenched his fists, forcing his body to stay calm. Every instinct screamed for him to walk away. But the fire inside him wouldn't let it go. He locked eyes with Susan, his gaze steady, defiant. "Don't put your hands on me again," he said, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered just beneath the surface. Susan's face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, so now you're threatening me?" she spat, stepping closer. "You think you can intimidate me? You're nothing but—" Before she could finish, Marcus raised his hand and delivered a firm, controlled slap across her cheek. It wasn't out of anger, but it wasn't gentle either. It was a statement, a line drawn in the sand. "Enough!" The crowd gasped audibly. Susan staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek, her mouth agape in disbelief. For a moment, there was silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, like a dam breaking, Susan erupted. "You animal!" she shrieked, her voice piercing and unhinged. "How dare you touch me? You're going to pay for this. Do you know who I am?" Marcus exhaled, keeping his voice measured. "You hit me first," he said simply. "You don't get to act like a victim." Her face turned red, her fury growing as she pointed wildly at him, addressing the onlookers. "You all saw it. He assaulted me. This thug thinks he can put his hands on me." Marcus glanced around, his chest tightening as he saw people whispering, some pulling out their phones. He knew how quickly this narrative could shift. He could already imagine the headlines, the assumptions. A black man hitting a white woman in broad daylight. It didn't matter that she had hit him first. It didn't matter that he had acted in self-defense. The world rarely cared about context in stories like this. "I'm not doing this with you," Marcus said, turning away and walking toward the store. His cheeks still burned from her slap, and his mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. But Susan wasn't done. "You're finished," she screamed after him. "Do you hear me? I'll ruin you." The automatic doors of the store closed behind Marcus, muffling her shrill voice. The stark contrast between the calm interior and the chaos outside was jarring. He gripped the handle of a shopping cart, his knuckles white as he tried to steady his breathing. Every muscle in his body was taut, his mind replaying the events over and over like a looped recording. He should have walked away sooner. But how could he? How many times could he let people like Susan cross the line without consequence? As Marcus navigated the aisles, trying to focus on the mundane task of grocery shopping, a different kind of anger settled in his chest. It wasn't the hot, immediate anger of the confrontation. It was colder, heavier, more familiar. It was the weight of knowing that no matter what he did, no matter how he carried himself, there would always be people like Susan who saw him as less than, who thought they could insult, demean, or even strike him without consequence. He reached for a loaf of bread, his hand pausing midair. He wasn't even sure why he was still trying to shop. His thoughts weren't in this store, they were still out in that parking lot, with Susan's words echoing in his mind. "You people, you don't belong here." Marcus placed the bread in his cart, forcing himself to move to the next aisle. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that Susan wasn't done. People like her rarely were. They needed to feel like they had won. And Susan, with her fury and entitlement, wasn't the type to let things go. He paid for his groceries quickly, the cashier's polite smile doing little to ease the storm brewing inside him. As he stepped back into the parking lot, the knot in his stomach tightened. From a distance, he could already see that something was wrong. The side of his car was marred by long, jagged scratches, as though someone had taken a key to the paint and gouged it out in deep, angry lines. His breath caught, and his fists clenched at his sides. It had to be her. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the damage to his car. The once sleek surface was now marred by deep, jagged lines, the paint stripped away in angry, deliberate strokes. His chest tightened as the realization hit him. This wasn't random vandalism. This was personal. Susan had done this, likely while he was inside trying to distract himself with groceries. She had wanted to leave her mark, to let him know she wasn't finished with him. His fists clenched at his sides as the weight of the day crashed down on him. The slap, the insults, the stares from the crowd, it had all been bad enough. But this was a step too far. This was a deliberate attempt to provoke him. to escalate a situation that was already simmering on the edge of explosion. His jaw tightened as he ran his hand along the grooves in the paint, feeling the depth of her hatred etched into the metal. From the corner of his eye, Marcus caught movement. Turning, he saw her, Susan, leaning casually against her white SUV a few cars away, her face smug and self-satisfied. She was watching him, her arms crossed as though she were admiring her handiwork. When their eyes met, her smirk widened, and she called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh no, looks like someone messed up your little car," she said, laughing as though it were the funniest thing in the world. "Guess you shouldn't have stolen my spot." Huh. Marcus took a step toward her, his body taut with restrained anger. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. Words felt useless in the face of someone so filled with venom, someone so determined to provoke him. She wanted him to lash out, to give her the reaction she could use against him. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, he forced himself to breathe, to focus on his options. He could call the police. He could file a report and let them handle it. But the thought of involving law enforcement made his stomach churn. Too often, people like him didn't get the benefit of the doubt in situations like these. He could already imagine how Susan might twist the story, how she might play the victim, painting him as the aggressor. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Susan laughed again, louder this time, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Go ahead. Call the cops. See how that works out for you." Her words were gasoline on the fire burning inside him. But Marcus forced himself to stay calm. He turned away from her, pulling out his phone and snapping photos of the damage to his car. Evidence. He would need evidence if this went any further. Susan's laughter stopped abruptly. Marcus turned just in time to see her climb into her SUV. For a moment, he thought she might leave, that perhaps she'd had her fill of destruction for one day. But then, without warning, the engine roared, and her vehicle lurched backward. The sound of crunching metal echoed through the parking lot as her rear bumper slammed into the front of Marcus's car. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched, disbelief and fury mingling in his chest. Susan looked back at him through the open window, her face alight with twisted satisfaction. Before speeding off with a screech of tires, Marcus stood there, his heart pounding, staring at the crumpled hood of his car. This was no longer a parking lot squabble. This was war. For a moment, he didn't move, his mind racing through the possibilities. But then his resolve hardened. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his hands shaking as he brought the device to his ear. The operator's voice came through, calm and professional. But Marcus could barely keep his voice steady as he explained the situation. "A woman just intentionally hit my car and drove off," he said, trying to keep his anger in check. "I'm following her now." The operator asked for details, and Marcus quickly described Susan's SUV, its license plate, and their location. He started his car, the engine sputtering but still functional, and began following her at a safe distance. His knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as he kept his eyes locked on her vehicle. Minutes later, the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared in the distance. Marcus exhaled, relief washing over him as he watched the officers intercept Susan at a red light. Her SUV pulled over, and Marcus parked a short distance behind, stepping out of his car to speak with the officers. Susan was already out of her vehicle, her arms flailing as she shouted at the police. Her voice carried across the parking lot, loud and indignant. "He attacked me. He's been following me. I'm the victim here." Marcus clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He approached the officers slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. One of them, a tall man with a measured expression, turned to him. "Sir, what's going on here?" the officer asked. Marcus took a deep breath, recounting the events as clearly and calmly as he could. "She's been harassing me since the parking lot. She scratched up my car, then rammed into it on purpose before driving off." The officer nodded, his face serious as he listened. "We'll check the damage and review any nearby surveillance footage." Susan, still clutching her car door for support, glared at Marcus with pure hatred. "You're lying," she shrieked. "You attacked me first." You people always think you can get away with anything." Marcus swallowed the retort that rose to his lips, letting the officers handle the situation. He'd had enough of her venom for one day. The parking lot had become a stage, and Marcus found himself at the center of an unwanted performance. Susan, now red-faced and trembling with rage, continued her frantic accusations, waving her arms and pointing wildly in his direction. The officers maintained their calm, though their eyes darted between Susan's SUV, Marcus's damaged car, and the irate woman whose voice only grew louder with every passing second. "I demand that you arrest him," she shouted, her voice shrill and commanding. "He assaulted me. He's dangerous." Marcus stood his ground, his heart racing but his posture steady. He knew the stakes were high. Too often, the loudest voice in the room drowned out the truth, and Susan was making sure hers was heard. But he also knew that the evidence was on his side. He had the photos of his car, the description of her actions, and, thankfully, the officer's measured demeanor gave him hope that they were listening. "Ma'am," one of the officers said firmly, stepping closer to Susan, "we're going to need you to calm down. Right now, we're gathering facts." Susan glared at him, her lips curling in disdain. "Facts? Look at me. I'm the victim here. Can't you see that?" The officer didn't waver. "We'll be the judge of that. Ma'am, please step back while we assess the situation." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a steady presence, approached Marcus. "Can you show me the damage to your car?" "Sir?" she asked, her tone professional but not unkind. "Of course," Marcus replied, leading her to the vehicle. He gestured to the long, jagged scratches along the side and the crumpled front bumper. His voice was calm, though he felt a simmering frustration beneath the surface. "She keyed the car while I was inside the store. Then, when I confronted her about it, she deliberately backed into me." The officer crouched down to inspect the damage, her eyes narrowing as she took notes. "These scratches are fresh," she said, mostly to herself. "And that bumper, did anyone witness her hitting your car?" "I didn't see anyone around, but she was still here when I came out. She even taunted me about it," Marcus explained, his voice tightening. "I have photos of the damage, too." The officer nodded. "Good. Let me take a look." Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling to the pictures he had taken moments after discovering the scratches. The officer studied them carefully, then turned back towards Susan, who was still ranting loudly a few yards away. Her claims of innocence and victimhood were wearing thin, and it was clear the officers were beginning to see through her facade. "Ma'am," the first officer said again, more firmly this time, "we need you to cooperate. This is a serious matter." Susan's face twisted with indignation. "Serious? You're taking his side, aren't you?" "Of course you are. You're all the same." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the same venom that had fueled her earlier tirade. The officers exchanged a glance, their patience clearly wearing thin. "Enough," the male officer said sharply. "Step back to your vehicle and remain there while we finish our assessment." Susan opened her mouth to protest, but was met with a stern glare. She hesitated, then finally retreated to the driver's side of her SUV, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The officers regrouped, conferring in low voices as they compared notes. After a few minutes, they approached Marcus again, their expressions serious but professional. "Mr. Jennings," the female officer began, "based on the evidence in your statement, we have enough to proceed. We're going to ask her to accompany us to the station for further questioning. You'll need to provide a formal statement there as well." Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady though his heart still raced. As the officers approached Susan, her indignation boiled over once more. "You can't arrest me," she screamed, backing away from them as they stepped closer. "This is ridiculous. He's the one you should be arresting." "Ma'am, we're not arresting anyone at this moment," the male officer said, his voice firm, "but you will need to come with us for questioning." Susan's eyes darted around wildly, her body tense as though she were considering bolting. But with both officers closing in, she finally relented, throwing up her hands in exasperation. "This is absurd," she muttered as they guided her toward the squad car. "You'll regret this. All of you will." Marcus watched as she was placed into the back seat, her furious muttering muffled by the closed door. The officers turned back to him, their professionalism intact despite the chaotic scene. "We'll need you to come to the station to finalize your statement," the female officer said. "You're free to follow us there." Marcus nodded again, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension began to ease. "I'll be there," he said, his voice firm. "Thank you." As the police car pulled away, Marcus stood alone for a moment. The quiet of the parking lot a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. He stared at the damage to his car, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. This wasn't over, but for the first time that day, he felt a sense of control, a belief that the truth might actually prevail. The police station was quieter than Marcus expected. The muted hum of voices and occasional clatter of keyboards created a sense of calm that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the parking lot. Marcus sat in a plain, windowless room across from Officer Reynolds, who had introduced himself earlier. His notepad rested on the table, ready to document the details of Marcus's statement. "Take your time," Reynolds said, his tone patient. "Just walk me through everything from the beginning." Marcus exhaled deeply, organizing his thoughts. He started from the moment he pulled into the parking lot, detailing Susan's accusations, her insults, the physical altercation, and finally the deliberate damage to his car. As he spoke, he felt the emotions of the day rising again: frustration, humiliation, and the simmering anger that he'd worked so hard to keep in check. "And then she hit my car on purpose before speeding off," Marcus concluded, his voice tight. "She didn't just insult me, she escalated it at every turn." Reynolds nodded, jotting down notes. "Your account matches the evidence we've gathered. The scratches, the photos, and the impact on your car's bumper all align with what you've described. And based on her behavior when we arrived, it's clear she wasn't trying to de-escalate." Marcus allowed himself a small sigh of relief. For once, it felt like the system might actually work in his favor. After finishing the statement, Reynolds handed Marcus a copy of the report and explained the next steps. "We'll forward this to the district attorney's office," he said. "Given the property damage and her assault on you, I don't think they'll hesitate to file charges. You'll be notified once a court date is set." Marcus nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly, though the weight of the day still hung heavily on his shoulders. As he walked out of the station, the cool evening air hit him like a bomb. He paused on the steps, letting the quiet settle over him. Susan was in custody. The truth was documented, and justice seemed within reach. But the satisfaction he expected to feel wasn't there. Instead, he felt drained, the day's events playing on a loop in his mind. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, presided over the proceedings with a firm but fair demeanor. Marcus sat silently as the prosecution laid out the case, presenting photos of the damage, witness testimonies, and the police reports. Every detail of Susan's actions was brought to light, leaving little room for doubt about her guilt. Susan's defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. Her lawyer emphasized her bad day, her frustration, and even her supposed remorse. Susan herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke of how provoked she had felt and how she regretted her actions. But the prosecution dismantled her arguments piece by piece, highlighting her pattern of escalation and her blatant disregard for Marcus's dignity and property. Witness after witness confirmed that Marcus had tried to walk away, that he had shown restraint even when provoked. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. Susan sat stiffly at the defense table, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. For the first time, it seemed, she was being held accountable. Outside the courthouse, Marcus stood on the steps, staring out at the city as reporters and onlookers dispersed. The trial had ended, but the larger battle, the one against the prejudice and entitlement Susan had embodied, was far from over. "Miss Hayes," the prosecutor, approached him. "You did the right thing," she said, Standing up for yourself isn't always easy, but it matters. Marcus nodded, her words sinking in. It's just exhausting, he admitted. People like her don't disappear. They just keep coming. Hayes offered a small, understanding smile. Maybe, but every time someone pushes back, it makes it harder for them to get away with it. What you did today sends a message. As she walked away, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been in his position, targeted, demeaned, and underestimated. The victory wasn't just his. It belonged to anyone who had ever been silenced by someone like Susan. Driving home that evening, Marcus reflected on the journey he'd taken over the past weeks. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. As he pulled into his driveway, he made a promise to himself to keep standing up, to keep pushing back, and to never let anyone make him feel less than he was. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle was over, and for the first time in days, Marcus could breathe. Thank you for watching this powerful story on Empathy Stories. Marcus's journey reminds us of the importance of standing up for ourselves and for justice, even in the face of prejudice and adversity. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories that inspire, empower, and connect us all. We'll see you next time with another tale of empathy and strength.